Our speaker today was born and raised on the Santa Gertrudis division of the King Ranch. Fabulous place. He was educated at Texas Tech, where he received his bachelor's and master's, and then went on to receive the PhD in physiology from Iowa State. Thereafter, he went to the Medical College of Virginia, where he was in the anatomy department, as I was at that particular time in ancient history. He then went to Tufts, where he became dean, a post he served for 5 years, before taking over as president of Texas Tech in Lubbock. During the Reagan administration, just a short time ago, he was appointed as the first Hispanic to the cabinet and made the Secretary of Education. And he continues in that role under President Bush at this time. Without going into his numerous doctorates, honors, services, and other public service contributions, as well as acknowledgments of prestige, it is my great pleasure and privilege to present to you the United States Secretary of Education, Dr. Lauro Cavazos.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, and what a privilege it is to be here, and a real honor to participate in the Reams lecture. It's clear that, Bill always had high standards, but then when they asked me to take it on, the lecture goes however. And also, this will be fun. Also I'm too good of a teacher. I can bounce off the back of that wall over there, and unless those of you that can't hear me, you're probably not going to miss a lot. But I also want to acknowledge the presence of my young mentor, Professor Emeritus Hegre and Mrs. Hegre. They're here, and he taught me more anatomy than he'd probably be ashamed to tell you how much I've forgotten, Professor Hegre. But how good it is to be back in Richmond. Great community, a great place. This afternoon I'd like to talk about some rather broad educational issues. Some issues in America, some of the problems that we're facing there, and perhaps some of the solutions. And when Dr. Reams asked me to give this lecture, he said, perhaps because you'll be talking to a lot of health professionals or future health professionals, you might talk a little bit about education of health professionals. But never following instructions from anyone, I thought I'd talk about the health professionals, yes, but I want to talk about elementary and secondary education and post-secondary education to show you how that is a continuity that occurs. And I don't mean to say that it's too late for you now because you're in post-secondary education, but I do want to comment on the state of education in this country. And then I will speak to some specifics about health education itself. Let's put the situation right out on the table and have people understand where we stand, where the issues are in America today relative to education. You're all very, very familiar with the budget and trade deficits. Well, I speak of a third deficit, and that's the education deficit. The education deficit in America. And just as the accountants in Washington, D.C. can quantitate to the last million in red ink our deficits in budget and trade, I think that we also can quantitate the education deficit. For example, how about 27 million illiterates in the United States today, and another 40 to 50 million people that read about the 4th grade level or below. The fact that 600,000 to 700,000 youngsters drop out of school every year. The loss of human potential is truly enormous under situations like that, and America certainly cannot afford that. Are you aware that the graduation rate for those students to complete high school in 4 years is only 71%? A long way to go. And every time we do an international comparison of our students against the industrialized nations of the world, we're at the bottom in mathematics and almost the bottom in science. Oh, I could go on and on and on, but I think that this little litany of failure clearly quantitates the educational deficit. I'll also point out to you, though, that these three deficits are linked, and that America is not going to solve its budget and trade deficit until it solves its education deficit. And I'll develop that a little bit more. You're aware that in September of 1988, President Bush called an historic summit, a domestic summit. It was only the third summit in the nation's history. That's the bringing together the governors of the states, and this time he also included the cabinet and the president, to deal with a very specific issue in America. The first one was called by Theodore Roosevelt. It dealt with the environment. The second one, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and that one on the Depression. I refuse to call it the Great Depression, having lived through part of it. And then, of course, the third one on education. And it was quite a gathering. And they came out of there with a commitment to do the following three things: to set national performance goals for education in America, and second, to provide more flexibility and accountability in the use of federal dollars, and third, to restructure elementary and secondary education. Let me give you a quick rundown on the goals that were established by the president and the governors. By the year 2000, all children in America will start school ready to learn. Of course, this really deals with parents as child's first teacher, preschool education. Goal 2, by the year 2000, the high school graduation rate will increase to at least 90%. Remember, I said it was down in the low 70s. That means drastically reducing that dropout rate and keeping these youngsters in school. Goal 3, by the year 2000, American students will leave grades 4, 8, and 12 having demonstrated competency in challenging subject matters including English and mathematics, science and history, geography, and every school in America will ensure that all students learn to use their minds well so that they may be prepared for responsible citizenship, further learning, and productive employment in our society. Goal 4, by the year 2000, U.S. students will be first in the world in math and science. Goal 5, by the year 2000, every adult American will be literate. I mentioned the number to you a while ago, and will possess the knowledge and skills necessary to compete in a global economy and exercise the rights and responsibilities of citizenship. Goal 6, by the year 2000, every school in America will be free of drugs and violence and offer a disciplined environment that is conducive to learning. The other day, I was testifying in front of the Science and Technology Subcommittee of the House, and one of the congressmen asked me that specific question that you get some pretty specific ones there, but this one really dealt. They said, now the president articulated a goal that by the year 2000, U.S. students will be first in the world in science and math. He said, Mr. Secretary, do you think that that's a reasonable goal? Do you think it can be achieved? Knowing where I was and that I was dealing with the Congress and in Washington, D.C., I said yes and no. Yes and no. No, if we continue to educate in the same fashion that we're doing today, without changing the system itself. Yes, if we totally restructure and change our educational system, putting in new emphasis and new teaching techniques, new curricula, yes. I reminded him also that people laughed when they said we'll go to the moon in a decade, President Kennedy's statement, and we went to the moon. Because the entire resource of the nation was focused, the intellectual resource, skills were brought to bear, preparations were made, and we went to the moon. Right? And so therefore you might even think in the same way, yes and no, to every one of these objectives that has been laid out here. And you may think about these issues, and I'll link them subsequently to some goals for higher education. But let me comment briefly on the other two issues that came out of that historic meeting. Now, 70 miles, I guess, to Charlottesville, all that it is from here. Dealing with flexibility and accountability, we're trying desperately to loosen up our regulations in terms of use of federal dollars. But in the same way, we have asked, of course, that the states remove some of their restrictions, but they also must be accountable for the dollars that they receive. The third issue is an issue that I have been talking about quite a bit since I arrived in this job, and that was restructuring education. Now, what do I mean by restructuring education? These are the strategies that we must put in place to change the educational system in such a drastic fashion that our students will be able to compete again. For example, we talk a lot about academic choice, and I always couple that with school-based management. Giving parents the selection of the school that their son or daughter should attend, where it's going to be. We know good and well that students learn under different situations, so selection of the best kind of academic setting for them. We pride ourselves in America very much about our choice in what car we drive or where we live, our church. We certainly don't have any choice as to where we go to school. That's an assignment, and that's where we go. So what we're really saying is, let's create some competition in the system itself, change the system, but at the same time give teachers and parents and principals school-based management, give them the authority to make decisions about what kind of school they're going to be. In America today, about 60% of the dollars spent on education goes to administration. That's only 40% that's getting back down to that level. And so what we're really trying to provide here is to create differences between schools. If you create differences and then select, then I think now you've got a choice. But as others have said, choice between two poor schools is no choice at all. So the two must be coupled together. We talk about alternative certification of teachers, for example, and principals. I think that's an important direction for us to go into, to bring in others who have experiences in science and mathematics, in English and history, who are poets and philosophers, who can join the teaching corps, have some instruction, and teach. A great way to attract a lot of minority teachers into the system. Are you aware that 30% of the students in American public schools today are either Hispanic or black, and only 11% of the teachers are Hispanic or black? We desperately need to have a new push in this direction, and I cite that alternative certification because New Jersey has increased its number of minority teachers by about 26% using that same technique. We need to put a lot of emphasis on early childhood education. Then we have to have flexibility on how we go to school, how many days, how many hours. Oh, I could go on and on and on with these strategies, but I'm just giving you some examples of the kinds of things we need to do. Now some of you might say, well, Maybe we need to put more money into the system. That's always a good solution that we work at very strongly here in the United States. This year, the nation will spend $353 billion on education. That's elementary and secondary and post-secondary, public and private. It will spend $199 billion in elementary and secondary education as part of that 353. Since 1980-81, adjusted for inflation, we have had a 27% increase in our spending for education. That's $42 billion up to last year. And every time I report the international comparisons and the scores, they're flat. We've not improved. And what I'm really getting at is not an issue of dollars. We've run that experiment. We've run it so many times, and we always come up with the same results. Well, maybe we need to change the system. Coming back to those goals, though, a lot of emphasis on English and math and science and history, geography, learning to think. You're probably wondering, well, what about higher education? Why didn't they talk about higher education? Well, most of the topics that they dealt with really was in elementary, secondary, but I was quite insistent that they deal with post-secondary education as well. And basically, that final objective, or the next last objective, that dealt with being able to go on and extend their education is really looking at post-secondary education. Well, I decided I'd establish some goals. Everybody else is doing it. So at a speech before the American Council on Education last month, I suggested a set of goals for the higher education community to focus on, some things that perhaps they might be able to achieve by the year 2000. So I'll summarize those briefly for you at this time. First, by the year 2000, we should strive to narrow the gap in degree completion rates between black and Hispanic students on the one hand, and Anglo and Asian students on the other. Currently, 55% of black students and 51% of Hispanic students who enter an institution of higher education do not earn any credentials, compared with 33% of the other group. We ought to cut that gap in half. Second, 50% of all bachelor degree recipients should demonstrate proficiency in a language other than English. Currently, only 10% of our graduates are proficient in another language. Third, by the year 2000, all associate and baccalaureate degree recipients should be proficient in college-level mathematics and science. Currently, less than half of all graduates take more than 2 science courses, and 20% take no mathematics at all. Fourth, we must ensure that all graduates are able to write coherent, grammatically correct papers and display a basic knowledge of world history, geography, and culture appropriate to their degree level. I think that's really a rather startling kind of statement to make to some college students, isn't it? But I mean it. Fifth, we need to increase the number of U.S. college graduates completing doctoral programs in the arts and in the sciences by 25% by the year 2000. We must increase the number of women, blacks, Native Americans, Hispanics earning doctoral degrees by 50%. Let me tell you about the PhD shortage that's just around the corner. A recent study that was just commissioned, just came out, and pointed out that we spend a lot of time talking about, well, we're going to need more mathematicians and more engineers, scientists at the PhD level to staff our universities. We're going to need them in every discipline. Every discipline, English and mathematics, yes, and history and science, yes, and music and philosophy. between 1995 and 2010, 300,000 faculty members will retire. Remember, they all came out, we had all the great growth of the universities. 300,000 faculty members. That means you have to start almost today to prepare that faculty. Huh? I don't know why we're sitting here listening to me. We have to start today to prepare that faculty. Now, that's going to be a marvelous window of opportunity for women, for Hispanics, blacks, Native Americans, and other minorities to enter that teaching pool. And that window will slam shut after those 15 years, and it's going to be another 30, 35 years down the road again. So what I'm saying, here is really an opportunity for us to put some special emphasis and change our universities drastically. You may not be aware of it, that today, if you exclude the historically black colleges and universities, only 4% of our faculty in the United States today are black, and 1.5% are Hispanic. And think of our changing nation and what the implications of those figures mean. Sixth, all students graduating from post-secondary institutions must demonstrate the critical thinking and problem-solving skills needed to productively contribute to the economic and political life of this nation. Now, that's where I stopped when I talked to the American Council on Education. I think it was last week I also talked to a group of student leaders from throughout the United States. And I thought that this would be an excellent time to add a seventh goal. Because many of the goals that I talked about really did relate to improving minority participation in higher education. But I really believe that in order to achieve these goals, there's a seventh one that we must have in there. By the year 2000, we must eliminate all vestiges of racial and ethnic discrimination on our nation's campuses. You may wonder about that. Let me tell you, our Office of Civil Rights has seen the numbers go up like this. You can hardly pick up an issue of the Chronicle of Higher Education without seeing what they call an incident. And so therefore I spoke to that issue and I added on as one of the other major directions. Now, many people have said to me that these goals are really laudable, both in elementary, secondary, and post-secondary, and I hope that each university, and I hope that this university, will consider these goals that I've talked about. I know that every campus has their own set of goals, but blend in some of these ideas that I've tried here because it will totally shape your education. And the reason I chose to start out talking about elementary and secondary is that the quality of student that comes to this university will be no better than the quality of student that's out there in elementary and secondary education today. So therefore, we're all a piece of that set. And failure to educate in one part will result, of course, the impact subsequently in higher education. And you may say, well, I don't really understand. What should be my role as a faculty member, as a staff person here, or a student? What should be my role? What can I do about elementary and secondary out there? You can do a lot. Participate in the restructuring of education. Participate in tutoring, mentoring, showing the way. Reach out into that community and help change it, because America must address this issue. If it does not, we're going to have some serious problems. I have a lot of people who tell me from time to time, oh, we must upgrade education in America today so that we can compete against the industrialized nations of the world at the turn of the century. And I say that we must educate every person to his or her fullest potential, because they're members of humankind. And the kind of America we're dreaming about is not going to happen as long as someone is uneducated. I feel very, very deeply and strongly about this issue. And so therefore, I think that it is important that we all work in these different directions and achieve what we're talking about now. Now, let me come back to the issue of broad education in English and history and literature and art, and critical thinking, analytical skills. And those are the things that I hope that every one of you are anticipating professional career in the sciences. You take a lot of that while you're here. Take a lot of that while you're here. That's not to say that you should neglect science and math. That's certainly critical. But we're having a lot of focus in this nation about science and math, and that's great. And we need to pursue that. But we also need to balance it out in terms of English and history and literature and arts, critical thinking, analytical skills. Because for those of you that go on to, let's say, medical school or dental school or a professional school in the sciences, there'll be ample time for science, I promise you, to get a lot of science. And while you're going through it, there'll be a lot of times saying, oh, if I could just get through this, and there's so many good books I want to read. I made myself that promise when I was in graduate school. But all of the great books that I'd failed to read in high school and in college, I got out and I'm still working on those great books. What I'm really getting at is the basis must be built ahead of time. Because oftentimes when you do enter into science and math, when you do enter into the disciplines of medicine or nursing or allied health or dentistry, there's not a lot of time. You know, unfortunately, many students come to the university and only take science and math because they're pointing in one direction. So that means that they really got the last significant education in history and English back in high school. So what I'm getting at is this is a long continuum. You can say, well, that's fine. But what other implications do you see coming from these kinds of things? For those of you that will go on into the health professions, you certainly need to have literate patients. They ought to be able to follow directions. Even those that can read today still don't follow a physician's directions, bad enough as it is. I lead the way. But we could do such a tremendous upgrading of the quality of health care in this nation if our nation was literate. And you could prescribe something, and they could read it, and they could follow those directions. And you could have a discussion with them about problem, opportunity, or issue. And then think of all of the people that will be working with you in hospitals, in clinics, in other healthcare settings, the auxiliaries. They have to be certainly highly prepared, well-skilled, literate, thinking people. And so therefore, it is not just for the health profession that we emphasize these things. It's for everyone in this total effort. You may say, well, these things that you talk about seem rather distant to achieving. And I've told you that I think that we can achieve them. But I really must point out to you that there is no quick fix to the educational deficit. People have said to me, you've been on the job almost a year and a half and we've still got the same set of problems. Huh? I've said, well, there are really 4 critical things that you must do to attack this education deficit. First, you must raise awareness of the citizens of this nation to the seriousness of the educational deficit. I do not believe that in America today they still acknowledge or will acknowledge the fact that we have this tremendous problem in education. If they would have, why didn't they change the system? But you talk to people and they'll say, oh no, our school's all right. It's the rest of the schools. Huh? It's kind of like people talking about, oh, I've got a great representative in the Congress. It's the rest of Congress. Huh? Or a great physician. It's the rest of the discipline. America must focus on that educational deficit, raise awareness, and you can do that as students, to go out there and really get that message across. And second, care. You know, meaningful change comes about through caring. If nobody cares about it, nothing's going to happen. We're going to continue doing it in the same old way. We're going to continue to suffer. And so therefore, caring becomes a vital portion of what happens. And when I drive, particularly through some rather difficult urban settings, and I see youngsters clearly who have dropped out of school, who are involved with all of the horrors that can be associated with drugs, I think to myself, nobody seems to care. Nobody seems to care, but I do believe that people in this nation care. And so therefore, we must do that. I've said before, if you want to stem the dropout rate, there are two things that you must do. Start in earliest childhood education, because by the time they're 2 years old, a youngster has developed self-esteem and motivation, two characteristics that will keep them off of drugs and keep them in school. And secondly, care. You can predict those people at risk. And when I've talked to them, I've said, why didn't you drop out? And they've said to me, somebody cared, my teacher, my parents, friends, somebody cared. And I think certainly America must start doing that again. Third, we must raise our expectations. If we continue to accept second rate, if we continue to say, well, this is all right, this is all right, and we can't compete academically, raise expectations of students at all levels, and they'll achieve those expectations. And fourth, you must work together. We must work together as a nation to address the ills that we have in front of us. And so therefore, I hope that I've been able to show you that there is a continuity between what has happened out there in elementary and secondary, what is happening to you today, what will happen to you in your profession, what will happen to you as a citizen of this nation. It's a very clear continuum. Right now it has barriers, pits, and problems. But there are solutions and ways over those problems if we come together as a nation and focus on it. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
The Secretary has agreed to entertain any questions there may be.
Yes, we start here.
When you were talking about being able to support the system when the children are at their nurturing age of 1 and 2, how do you suppose you're going to be able to do that?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. I wanted to talk about that, but my wife Peggy and I, we're the world's expert on children. We have 10 of them. We spend a lot of time thinking about education. I think that's the key to it right there, is preschool education. Let me give you some examples, some things that are occurring in this nation. If you go back and look at Dr. Brazelton's work, for example, he's already shown very, very clearly that this is occurring. Motivation, self-esteem, well developed. In fact, he sees it even when they're still 1 year old. Coming back to the point that I made about Peggy and I, we were talking about daycare one day, providing daycare, making sure the children had good daycare. And I kept talking about education in that same setting. He said, well, quit talking about daycare. Why don't you talk about learning and care? Learning and care. That's the time when you start teaching youngsters. And there's some good examples of that in Miami, in Rochester. Businesses, and see this, I said everybody working together. Businesses now open up these, quote, daycare centers for their workers. But in Miami, the county now, Dade County, provides the teachers to come in there And they start teaching you at that very, very early age. And I think I'd like to see that spread even more. And as you know, the one clear commitment I saw coming out of Charlotte dealt with Head Start. That's a program. Head Start is really a program that looks at totally at the youngster in terms of their health as well as their education. And I think the commitment there is to keep trying to get as many youngsters and cover as many of those as they can. What I said today is a real recognition now of how critical that early childhood time is in terms of education. Another question I saw another hand over here. Yes, sir.
You mentioned several times in the same breath accountability and flexibility. Some of those who work at the receiving end of various government bureaucracies, those two seem almost mutually exclusive at times. You agree that you must be accountable, your flexibility is limited. How do you understand that?
Yes. We have a lot of people who write regulations, trying to put in place those regulations as they affect, as the Congress has passed the law. And we must meet the intent of Congress so that the regulations are written. And what I've done already, I went back to them and I said, now go back and look at our regulations within the Department of Education. Those of you in education know we invented it probably. And look at those and see what we can do to make it more flexible. And secondly, we already are working now on a bill that we're going to propose to the Congress to provide more of that flexibility with our funding. And right now, in fact, I had a hearing the other day for the Congress, and this was dealt with the National Science Foundation and the Department of Education. And they said, why aren't you cooperating in science and math and working together? We had a lot of funding for science and math in the Department of Education. That obviously was NSF. And so there's one fundamental difference. NSF gets a block grant. They award these in certain areas that they've decided are important. The Department of Education has 200 categorical programs that the Congress has put in place up to the last detail. It will say you will set aside 0.5% for this group, or 1% for that group, or you must do that. So I said, Mr. Congressman, see the difference right there? We have zero flexibility. As a department, here I'm complaining about flexibility.
How does NSF avoid that?
Well, NSF, of course, they still, that doesn't mean that they don't have their own flexible kinds of things. But in the same way, as I've talked to the people in the Congress about this, they said, oh, we're all right at the federal level, it's at the state level. You governors need to go back, this is a session there with governors and Congress. You governors need to go back and open them up at the state level. What I'm getting at is we're doing our best, because we really need to open that issue up. But yet, we also must be accountable for every one of those dollars. Another comment or question? Yes, sir.
What role do you see the private sector, in particular the business community, playing in the restructuring of education?
It's one of the most vital issues that we face today. I've met with a lot of business leaders. We have a business roundtable, 200 to 500 companies come in to talk about these issues. Last year, American business spent $25 billion on remedial education. $25 billion on remedial education. These are high school graduates that they were hired. Think of what that does. So the business community now obviously recognizes that we really must upgrade the quality of that educational program. And secondly, a changing workforce. A workforce that we would not recognize by the year 2000. 30% of the new entrants to that workforce will be either women or minorities. And yet they're the ones that tend to suffer so much, so often, in terms of their educational achievement. And so everybody recognizes now that business must participate in that. And I've seen it, I can hardly go to a federal meeting or to a national meeting without some involvement. I would hope that right here in Richmond, business communities would get to work, working with the local school board, working with the local communities, to change the system. Now, I'm sure that some of you thought, question, well, why don't you just order it done? Order it done tomorrow. Man. The Department of Education has zero authority. Zero authority to impose restructuring or the changes that I've talked about. That's why I get so impatient with people who say, you haven't changed it. Why don't you do something about it? The change must come at the local level. That's where the business community can have its impact. That's where your school board can be effective. Our budget this year is $24.1 billion in my department. That is only 6% of the expenditure on education. And we're pretty well split. About 48% of our budget goes to elementary, secondary, and 43% will go to higher education, post-secondary education. And then there's some research money in that as well. But the only place where we have authority, if we don't bring the dollars, we have authority certainly in offset that responsibility. So what I've been trying to do is exactly what I tried to do here, is to get the citizens, get the business community, get the educational community, all to come together and change the system. The change must come from within. It cannot come from Washington, D.C. What I'm really getting at is there's where you can have a major role as a business community. I can tell you, people on the school boards listen to the business community. They also must listen to parents, they must listen to citizens about the kinds of changes that they must bring about. Yes, if I can.
The amount of minority teachers, is that directly related to the prejudices involved with administrators, or is it more of a product of a shortage of, let's say, Black and Hispanic teachers as a whole? What would you relate that problem directly to?
I relate the problem to a host of things. First of all, there are very, very few role models out there. We start talking about a small number of the kind that we've talked about. But when you drop, for example, in my own native state of Texas, 50% of the Hispanics drop out of school. In terms of blacks, it's about 34%. So you have this huge, huge loss right out of the system already. Now then you go to college level. Of those that survived that and got through the dropout part and got out of high school, now went on to college. It's about 7% of that group will complete a baccalaureate degree. Now, get them to the baccalaureate degree, and these figures now are about 3 years old, so they were shifting some. Get them to the baccalaureate degree, and only 2% of that 7% group that got through this other system will complete a graduate degree or a professional degree. What I'm getting at is that the numbers are so small that are coming out of here for a host of reasons back at the beginning. Economic issues obviously oftentimes play a role. And youngsters will drop out of school because they have an economic incentive there that they've got to get to pursue. That's why I barely touched on it, but people say to me, well, we only go to school in the United States 180 days. That's the lowest number of days attendance of any of the industrialized nations of the world. 180 days, most around 220, 240. They said, shouldn't we just raise our number to 220 or 240? I'll get back to your point, but I want to close this together. And I'll say, well, how are you using the time that you have right now? How are you using the time you have right now? Secondly, tell me what you do with the new time that you would have, should you have that. What I propose, and maybe somebody somewhere will has started doing this, is flexibility again, so that the schools stay open. The assumption that we have in this country that 180 days, everyone's going to learn in 180 days. Well, how about somebody learning in 200 or 140 days or less and accelerating? Given that opportunity of flexibility And then coming back to the economic issue, keep the schools open from 7 in the morning until, let's say, 10 o'clock at night, so that a young person that has to work can come back to school later on. It opens up the whole early childhood issue again, and opportunities to go to school as well. So we have not thought through that issue. You say, well, that costs a lot of money. Well, these are some fundamental issues. I always ask, how are you spending your dollars right now? Look to see where those are going. And then finally, when you say, well, what's happening to them? Why aren't they going to that? Thank heavens. Finally, medical schools, dental schools, law schools, nursing schools, other kinds, finally starting to accept minorities into the system. So now there's a lot of competition. The business community really wants those people. Come out of there with an MBA or a baccalaureate degree, they're picked up right away. And so therefore, they're not entering this profession. Now, the profession itself, the profession of teaching, a great profession. Financial reward, not there. So they need to look at that issue. And there are a lot of other issues that you need to look at. So I think that there's not an easy answer to what I'm getting at. There are a lot of issues that are before us that they express. Let me take one more question, and then I'll let you go. Professor Hager.
Thank you. It seems to me that in medical education we've come across a couple of techniques that could be adapted by education schools. Going about teaching, you're going to have to go about teaching a lot of people how to teach. When they finish our medical school, then they go through a process of what we call an internship. Before they can hang up their shingle and say, I know all about how you use your eyes and how you take care of your eyes or your brain or whatever, they go to school from 4 to 6 more years in what we call an internship. We have nothing like that in education schools as far as I know. So why not start something like that and now when we learn how to teach and go about following through board rounds and so on, or something that compares somewhat to what they do in medical school. So after a certain number of years of watching how it's done by professionals, and of course they have to be paid while they're doing this, don't they? You know? And when they've been 4 years or 6 years on top of their medical school, then they can command some kind of salary cap because they really know something about how you go about doing this or that. They've got credentials now. We don't have that in education schools as far as I know. It'll be about 60 years now, in another year since I taught my first class. And all I liked at the time, there was no kind of an internship that I served.
Well,
There's another thing about it. When they fail, after they get all done, and they get a casualty, they have to have a conference about this thing. Why in the world did this happen? What did you do? When did you notice that he was going downhill? You prescribed this, but you shouldn't prescribe that because that lay him back for another couple of weeks. Isn't it?
about health care.
That's a path conference.
Oh, yeah.
And the teachers, the physicians that follow this fellow have to get up there and say, well, now, yes. I know his temperature was thus and so, and his blood was this and so, and I did this and so. Somebody else gets up and say, well, you shouldn't have done that then, shouldn't you? And too many mistakes like that, pretty soon they're out looking for another place to hang up their shingles. And it works.
I know. Let me respond to this. I learned how to be a good teacher, and I am a good teacher, from you after I finished all my education. I followed you around in many, many ways. But let me just say the following. The education profession right now, okay, is really going through the same kind of revolution, asking the same set of questions. And the trend that I see coming, and it's already probably in about a third of the states, that people will major in the area that they're going to teach. For example, if you're going to be a mathematics teacher, you'll major in mathematics, take your baccalaureate degree in mathematics, but you're also going to take 12, 16, 18 hours of education. This is learning how to teach. Then the direction they're going into is adding on another year into that 5th year to do postgraduate work, either a master's and going on from there into the doctoral level. So we're seeing that change come about, and I think it's a good one. We have we've had a lot of problems with, because people sometimes end up having to teach chemistry, and they may have had a whole degree in education, for example, but only 6 hours in chemistry, instead of reversing that situation. That's a trend I see coming out. In fact, I gave a talk to the to the faculty's education national meeting in Chicago last month, and proposed in many of the same ways. I talked about that they need to restructure their own educational programs because, one, that'll result in better education, but secondly, if they don't do it, somebody else is going to do it for them, and it's going to happen, unfortunately. I would rather give leadership. Well, I've come now to the time here, and I again want to thank every one of you for your participation and your attention. Again, I want to thank Dr. Reeves for inviting Peggy and I here. We're delighted to be here, sir.
Mr. Secretary.